Chapter 46. Dr. Robert D. Dr. Robert D. had grown up in Surrey, England through the 1970s and 1980s, backed by a musical soundtrack of some of the most eclectic music seen to that date. At 18 he had gained entry to the University of Surrey, where he studied physics and chemistry. He was very fortunate that he was able to stay at the same university for his entire progression from bachelor to doctorate qualifications. It had taken quite some time, but he had been in no hurry. For some reason, ever since he had been a young boy watching films and TV series, he had known he was destined for great things. He grew up watching Star Wars and Star Trek, Disney's The Black Hole, basically anything where the story went anywhere near space travel and science fiction. He became captivated by faster-than-light, FLT, travel, be that a hyperspace drive or a warp drive. The idea that space and time could be bent to your whim and distances beyond reason be traveled in an instant mesmerized him as much as the creatures and stories portrayed on screen. He had rarely spoken out about his dreams of FLT. It would have been career suicide to even think about a warp drive, but as if some inner knowledge had forced him, he had written a paper in the early 1990s that had expanded on his ideas. He'd no idea if anyone had actually read it, but at least two people had: Mexican physicist Miguel Alcubierre soon after its publication, and one Sebastian Sollers in the early 21st century. The publication had led Miguel to think on the matter, and in 1994 he had proposed a theory for changing the geometry of space by creating a wave that would cause the fabric of space ahead of a spacecraft to contract, and the space behind it to expand. A spaceship would then ride this wave in a region of flat space, known as a warp bubble. The warp bubble itself would not move but instead be carried along, moved as a result of the actions of the drive. Initial reactions were that negative energy would be required to create the warp bubble. Harold Sonny White had responded that the amount of energy required could be reduced if the warp bubble were changed into a warp ring. At first, a few scientists won grants to study these matters, but as the 20th century ended, and the 21st gathered pace, every scientific discipline was starting to come round as more and more meat were added to the bones of warp drives and space-time. Now, though, in a laboratory in Kiruna, Sweden, Dr. Robert D. was watching the universe unfold in front of his eyes. In the days since the first experiment, they had constructed means of controlling the fields, vectoring them consciously as needed as opposed to the prevention of accidents. The warp bubble created by the activated solarium was becoming more and more controllable, more and more predictable. He had started to develop equations to explain and predict the actions of the warp bubble, and the testing now turned to the proving of these equations. These equations that would eventually form the basis on both teleportation and time travel. Everything was going extremely well. Days had turned to weeks, weeks to months. Dr. Robert had rarely slept. He was far too eager to move forward. However, every 10 days or so he would simply collapse and have to be taken to his quarters, where he would sleep for a day only to wake with another new insight that drove them forward until his next, inevitable fatigue-induced rest. Sebastian simply sat back and watched his future unfurl before him. The only issue was the availability of solarium. He had sent geologists around the world to locate more, but none had yet been discovered. Dr. Robert assured him there was enough to complete the experiments. Sebastian did not doubt that the experiments were secure. He doubted that there would be sufficient for the first jump. Without that first jump, his whole future would unravel, if not simply poof into non-existence, as may he.